Hey everybody, Professor Benalou here with the second of 3 short videos of me explaining Unit 2 discussion board. In this video, I'm going to go over the first of the 3 topics that you can choose from, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Vietnam War protests. So the Bay of Pigs invasion, the primary document that you're going to analyze in this case is a letter written from Presidential Advisor Richard N. Goodwin to President Kennedy regarding the Bay of Pigs. So let me give you a little bit of background information on the Bay of Pigs, my wonderful students. 1959, the Cuban Revolution brought the communist government of Fidel Castro to power. And that was very upsetting to the U.S. government because, Key West is just 90 miles north of Cuba. Plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion actually were formulated during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with the CIA. The plan was the CIA had trained Cuban exiles to invade Cuba at a location known as the Bay of Pigs. And it was hoped that when the Cuban exiles started the invasion, the Cuban citizens would join the Cuban exiles in rising up against Castro and ousting Castro from power. Eisenhower did not have enough time to implement the Bay of Pigs before he left office. So President Kennedy, when he became president in January of 1961, inherited the plan for the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs invasion occurred April of 1961. The U.S. government had promised the Cuban exiles to support them with 2 airstrikes. After the first airstrike, it was obvious that the U.S. government was involved, so Kennedy canceled the second airstrike. About 1,200 exiles were taken prisoner and 100 were killed. It was an absolute fiasco. President Kennedy had to negotiate the release of the imprisoned exiles. Okay, so topic number 2 also involves Cuba, but this incident is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred a year and a half after the Bay of Pigs. Okay, don't get things confused because a lot of students do. The primary document for this topic is actually a YouTube video of President Kennedy addressing the nation regarding the Bay of Pigs. October 1962, U.S. military surveillance planes photographed nuclear missile sites being constructed in Cuba by the Soviet Union. The Kennedy administration had 2 options as to responding to the information that the Soviets were producing, or construction, I might rather say, constructing nuclear missile sites in Cuba. Number 1, they could order an invasion of Cuba, which a year and a half after the Bay of Pigs, maybe not so much. Number 2, placing a naval blockade against Cuba. Kennedy chose the naval blockade because he feared an invasion would lead to intervention by the Soviet Union. Negotiations during this Cuban Missile Crisis lasted a very tense 13 days. It was the closest the United States has ever been to nuclear war. The Kennedys famously had a mansion in Palm Beach, and there's an area near Palm Beach called Peanut Island, and they actually had a nuclear bunker for President Kennedy on Peanut Island. You used to be able to tour the Kennedy's bunker in Peanut Island, but unfortunately, it makes me so sad, they let it go into disrepair and they stopped the tours. But anywho, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother, wrote of his experience being a cabinet member during the Cuban Missile Crisis within his famous book, 13 Days. 13 Days was also turned into a famous movie. The Soviets ended up removing their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. promising that we wouldn't invade Cuba. But what I find so incredibly fascinating about all this is, during the Cold War, kids were taught after the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, darn it, we stared down the Soviets and they blinked, they removed their missiles from Cuba. That's not the whole story, okay? The government didn't reveal the whole story until fairly recently. In exchange for the Soviets removing the missiles from Cuba, we removed our missiles from Turkey and Greece, and those negotiations ended the Cuban Missile Crisis after a tense 13 days. Okay, the next topic I want to go over, the last topic I'll be going over in this video, is the Vietnam War protests. John Kerry gave this speech in front of a congressional committee April 23rd, 1971. He served from U.S. Senator from Massachusetts from 1985 until 2013. And Carey was the Democratic Party nominee for president in 2004. And he served as Secretary of State under President Obama from 2013 until 2017. And he will play in a role as a key environmental advisor in the upcoming Biden administration. But we're focusing in on the fact here that from 1966 until 1970, Carey served as lieutenant in the United States Navy fighting in Vietnam. He became very disillusioned through his service in Vietnam, which led him to join Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Vietnam Veterans Against the War is a group that was formed in 1967, and it consisted of those that served in Vietnam that were now opposed to the war. And Carey was very vehemently opposed to the war after coming home. In this speech he gave to a congressional committee April 23rd, 1971, expressing his disillusionment. All right, everybody, that covers the first 3 topics that you can choose from for this assignment. My third and final video will be going over the last 3 topics: the women's rights movement, the Chicano rights movement, and the Black Power movement. All right, I will see you in video number 3.